This is the
Five Starr
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. Hi. What do you guys want to talk about? This is such good shit. Thanks, guys. Back to you.
Y'all ready for this? Trademark. Well, I'm ready for this. I'm ready for more pain, punishment, and torture. Nah, never mind. I'll save that for the Monday show. I have not watched Retro Raw yet, so I have no idea what I'm in store for there. But I do know I'm in store for some classic wrestling talk here today with the good old territory footage. And if you're a recurring viewer to the channel, you know what we're looking at. Welcome everybody to the Five Starr Wrestling Report. We are on YouTube and Rumble every Monday and Friday for news shows. If you're watching for the first time, welcome. If you are a returning viewer and you have not already subbed to the channel, first off, you're cruel. But do it. Help a brother out. And also make sure you give the show a like to show your support. Comments are always nice to have too. Just don't give me those Rumble spam comments where you're trying to sell me stuff. I mean, like actual authentic comments. Not business service. But today's show is going to be a lot of fun. We have some good stuff to talk about, especially with Midsouth. A lot of big developing stories on that program. But before I get too excited and jump halfway down my notes, we'll do the usual Crockett TV review and talk about the good, bad, and the ugly of that 90-minute marathon. It really is always a mixed bag when it comes to World Championship Wrestling. And before we get into the actual program, I had to write down this line from the Fantastics Hype VTR. I totally missed this the other week when they aired the first one. The opening line for the VTR, and I quote, "Tag teams are tag teams." And I paused it there, sat in complete and utter silence for about, say maybe about a minute. And that's when it finally hit me. Well, isn't that pretty self-evident? Tag teams are tag teams. And they may as well just follow that up by saying, water is wet. The sky is blue. And of course, the payoff is them explaining that in the NWA, tag team wrestling is fantastic. It was a pun. Laugh, damn it. It's funny. Not as funny as them still trying to get Jim Crockett to show some honest-to-God personality on camera. And they've been trying that for better part of 3 years now. He's still about as animated as a rotting corpse. But they had him with Tony Schiavone here to basically do a couple plugs for the Clash of Champions and the Crockett Cup. The big thing was him announcing that the Clash will be on March 27th, and it will be commercial-free. Or at least that's what they're aiming for. I guess they still weren't entirely sure at the time. Still had to clear with the network. But, well, from there, they pitched over to Jim Ross and David Crockett to make a couple more show announcements, including the fact that Shane Douglas was originally scheduled to wrestle Mike Rotunda for the TV title this week. But as of this point, he has not quite arrived at the building. So they were unsure whether or not that match was going to have to be changed or not. And so naturally, David Crockett totally blows the conversation off so he could fawn over Lex Luger and Barry Windham. So in walks the total package, and he opens his promo with the following statement. This is how you begin a professional wrestling show. As Luger walks in and immediately starts unbuttoning his shirt to reveal his abs to the crowd. Didn't even get one single sentence out before the shirt came off this week. No, Luger wasn't wasting any movement here. He's like, I got to hook the ladies from the jump before they get bored. I've got it. I'll take my shirt off. So while he's running down some of the Varsity Club business, mainly bringing up the story of last week where they tried to choke the life out of Barry with a coat hanger, he's saying that nothing about that attack resembles professional wrestling. I believe his exact line, the well-spoken verbal communicator that Luger was, he goes, the cheap, underhanded tactics that you've evolved to right now don't resemble pro wrestling in any little bit of a way. In any little bit of a way. A cunning linguist. Brilliant speaker that Lex Luger was. Shakespearean in its delivery. And he eventually made a point that he and Barry are coming after Tully and Arn for the World Tag Belts. I was still hung up on the previous comments about the Varsity Club. But once Luger stepped out of the frame, JR came back over so they could pitch to a Sting pre-tape, where he was beating up on Johnny Savage on one of the Sunday syndicated programs. Still trying to rally up hype for that match with Flair in Greensboro on the 27th. I could have sworn they aired this exact same piece of video feed the other week. Maybe it was a different opponent. But I could have sworn there was a 20-second clip of Sting squashing a random job guy. Could have been John Savage. Could have been somebody else. Who knows? But since we're on the subject of Flair and Sting, it was the perfect segue as they came back from break for JJ and Flair, where Flair informed us that he is reeking of sex appeal. Okay, then. So he told Sting that the pressure's on as the anticipation builds for the clash on the 27th. Flair wants Sting to think real long and real hard about the situation he's in right now. It is the moment where he has to prove to everybody that he can hang with the 60-minute man. And whether it's 60 minutes or 10 minutes, the fact is it's make or break for Sting's career. And that is by and large mostly true. And we often talk about the position they put Sting in this early into his career. I mean, there was absolutely a ton of pressure on Sting going into that match in Greensboro. I mean, it could have easily flopped. Been a one-trick pony example of a young guy that showed some promise early on, but fell short of the mark when it counted the most. But now they took a risk, and it paid off. It was a good Ric Flair promo when you look at the root of the material here. Minus the sex talk. But boy, have we come full circle. And here I am in 2024, recounting the very early beginnings of Sting's career. And, just as little as over a couple weeks ago, the guy retired. And boy, did he go out with a bang. I would argue it was more of a whimper, but we're not going to get into talking about AEW right now. But from there, we went back to the ring where the Road Warriors killed Gary Phelps and Keith Steinborn in a few seconds. Yet still in this minute and a half squash, Hawk still managed to completely whiff dropping a fist on one of the guys. Then he tagged out so Animal could hit a lariat for the 3 count. Still sporting the protective face mask, by the way. And still sounding like Darth Vader during his promos. Now, admittedly, most of Animal's promo was inaudible, but he basically vowed that the Road Warriors were going to get the revenge on the Powers of Pain, which led to Hawk taking over and calling the Powers of Pain Bum-Barian and Waffle Lord. Why not Barf-Barian? Wouldn't that have made more sense? I'm also not being frivolous when I tell you that Hawk essentially told the Powers of Pain to go commit suicide. Says it'd be a much better alternative than to get inside a barbed wire match with the Road Warriors and Dusty when they're already out for blood anyway. He said after they get through choking the life out of the POP with the barbed wire, it will only scratch the surface of getting even. And Paul Ellering wrapped up with something that was slightly less memorable and less fiery than Hawk vowing legitimate homicidal acts on the heels. I wish Hawk would have choked the life out of me with that barbed wire if it meant I didn't have to watch the jive tones in action. Good God. We just can't avoid these guys, can we? So they wrestled Rocky King and Gene Ligon. The longest, most gruesome 8-minute squash I think I've ever seen. The squash that would not end. The best part was for half the match, Jive Tones was actually getting their asses kicked. Rocky and Gene are working them over. Heels can't muster up any offense to save their life. Finally, they cut off Gene on the floor by running him into the ring post. Gene was taking these comical ass-over tea kettle bumps on the concrete that just were so over the top. But as the heels are working him over, I sort of spaced out for a few minutes until I saw Jive Tones hit Gene with a double Russian leg sweep for the pin. I mean, if anything interesting happened in that middle portion when I was on autopilot mode, I'd love to hear it. It'd be the first interesting thing someone would have ever informed me about Jive Tones. So then it's back to the booth for a Dusty promo. And on top of his couple Crockett Cup plugs, he then turned the subject matter over to Baby Doll, mostly regarding the evil envelope with those evil photos inside. And Dusty informs us that he's seen the confidential photos. And obviously, what Baby Doll is concealing from the naked eye is bogus. Because Dusty would never do those kinds of dirty, nasty things. As he proceeds to smirk at the camera looking like a sly dog. And, then he tells Larry to grow a set of balls and quit having a woman do his dirty work for him. Because if Baby Doll wants to be with a real man, she should ditch Larry and come over to Dusty's neck of the woods. So even when Dusty outright makes mockery of Baby Doll being a slut on TV, he's still down to fuck. The male anatomy, everybody. We men are very simple creatures. Call us whatever you want. But if you got boobies and a nice body, You know, we can overlook many nasty qualities about a woman. So then we came back for a nice golf clap reception for the Midnights as they took on Kurt Thompson and Trent Knight. This may have been Corny's wackiest outfit to date. And trust me, there have been some weird color schemes I've seen on that man. Get this attire. Red shirt, green tie, beige colored blazer, purple slacks, purple tennis racket, and brown dress shoes. I presume he was going for a knockoff Joker look, but I don't think even I could mistakenly mismatch colors like that, even if I were half asleep. Even JR couldn't help but poke fun at it. Couple great moments on commentary here as the match was going. Beautiful Bobby's in there working his magic by, feeding and taking the occasional bumps for the job guys. At the same time, he's totally in control of things. We get this phenomenally great slip of the tongue moment where Stan goes to try to beat up Trent Knight on the floor. So Corny, without even really thinking about the context, just goes, "Look at Stan, beating some meat out there." There's a slight hesitation as Cornette tries to move on to the next line. And then you hear him cackle to himself, probably because he legitimately popped himself and the announcers by using the term beating meat. My guess is he probably didn't think anything of it until he saw Tony and JR laughing. Then he realized what he actually said. Yes, Stan was beating meat on live cable television. And then at some point, Corny starts hyperventilating as he gets fired up ranting about the babyface teams. So Jim Ross mutters under his breath, "Somebody give this guy some milk." There was also something in here about Mexicans and Cornette making a joke about a pickup truck. That one sort of went over my head, but I think I could kind of figure out the rest. Eventually, the Midnights won with a Gravedigger. Then we cut to this awesome ringside promo with Cornette and the Midnights. And while he's rattling off a bunch of stuff about the hot tag teams in the industry, the Midnights are scalding. They're a cut above the rest, and the competition's not even close. And in fact, Corny's got a chip on his shoulder to vent about here. And it goes beyond the Crockett Cup issue. For the past 2 years, they've gotten screwed out of their number one seed earning because Jim Crockett's been conspiring to run those guys out of the company since day one. But this year, it's going to be different because the Midnights are going to get that number one ranked seed by hook or by crook. And as far as the competition in the NWA goes, the Midnights are sick of all the B and C level teams. They're tired of wrestling a bunch of unworthy bums. They want some real competition. Even if Jim Crockett has to dig up the bodies of legends and stick them in the ring with the Midnights. And again, while this is all being designed to eventually set up the Fantastics to chase after the Midnights in the U.S. tag straps, we've also got this lingering thing with the Horsemen to keep in our back pocket. Now, they still haven't outright mentioned them by name, but you can hear the subtle digs when Corny's talking about the fact that there's no suitable competition in the NWA. And while he's name-dropping guys like the Lightning Express, Douglas and Santana, a couple other mid-level teams, but he never outright mentions Tully and Arn. And at the same time, I think it's all being strategically done, just because of the fact that they're both still heel, technically. And because the Fantastics was the immediate game plan, the Horseman feud, I think, was something Dusty kind of had planned in the back of his mind for later on. Because if I remember right, Wasn't it Cornette who recommended to Dusty that they bring in the Fantastics for that mid-spring, early summer program? Like, to my knowledge, I don't think Dusty was originally planning on using the Fantastics. But because the Rock and Roll were gone by this point, it really didn't leave the Midnights with much of an option. You know, unless they wanted to go with the Tully and Arn feud before the Bash tour. And there's a lot of moving parts in all this. And it's really interesting seeing all this develop in real time again. Even though we all know what happens with the Horsemen later on in 88. You know, just the mere fact that they're alluding to things in passing goes to show that they were at least entertaining the idea. You know, because this is when bookers and promoters actually did long-term strategic planning. Not this week-to-week hotshot booking we see all the time nowadays, where nothing ever makes sense and nothing ever flows. From there, we went back to the ring for Ricky Santana versus Bob Riddle. They did very basic chain stuff for a couple minutes until Ricky came off the top and won with a body splash. Literally nothing else to say about it. I was bored to tears. And then we had a completely pointless Jive Tones promo, where I probably only retained about a quarter of the information here. I believe their main point was that they're excited for the Crockett Cup because they want to win that $1. Tiger Conway spoke like he had a frog in his throat, so you could barely understand him. Meanwhile, the job guy in the ring who was getting ready to wrestle next, he's like lingering in the backdrop, kind of rolling his eyes, probably thinking, oh, Jesus Christ. Can someone grab the hook and yank these guys out of the camera shot? I wish someone would have, because it would have been highly more entertaining than listening to these guys talk for an hour. But then we went back to Mr. Schiavone and Jim Crockett. They provided a status update on Shane Douglas. And we have now been informed that he was unable to make the show. Therefore, filling in to take his place and wrestle Mike Rotunda for the World's TV title later on will be none other than gorgeous Jimmy Garvin. Ironically, one of the individuals who currently has some beef to settle with the Varsity Club. So sucks to be Rotunda. It also sucks to be Shane Douglas. But, hey man, the show must go on. You can't make it regardless of what the rhyme or reason is. Gotta make changes where necessary. It's a cutthroat business. So more to come with that later on. Lex Luger wrestled Dale Lapperhouse, or Laperhouse, however it's pronounced. It actually hit me when they rang the bell for this match. When's the last time we saw Luger work a singles match on television? It's been a long time. I mean, he's been doing so much work with Barry Windham as a tag team. Kind of forgot that Luger used to be a singles wrestler at one point. Of course, it's the same formula for all of his matches. He does some moderately okay looking power stuff for a while, nobody gives a shit. And then he wins with a torture rack and people go crazy. Now, they weren't popping for it in 88 like they were about 10 years later on Nitro. But it did eventually become one of the more popular moves throughout the late 90s. Definitely a toss-up between that and the Diamond Cutter. And then we pitched back to the booth for a quick Jimmy Garvin promo. He says for the first time in his life, he's content with being a substitute, seeing as how he's getting a world title shot out of it. Or TV title. Substituting for, quote, Sean Douglas. This guy clearly didn't give a shit anymore. But he's had his issues with the varsity club for a while, and Mike Rotunda is the perfect guy to get revenge on. He's going to take his title, humiliate him, and make sure that Kevin Sullivan regrets the day he ever mentioned his lovely squeeze. And this part of the end was great, as he's shouting and screaming at the camera. He goes, "After I win the TV title, I'm going to be even more happy than I am right now." If Jimmy Garvin's definition of happy is him blaring to the top of his lungs like a deranged lunatic, God, I want to know what Jimmy Garvin sounds like pissed off. I'd be a little concerned about that. Not as concerned as I was for Rick Rossi and Randy Hogan. Those poor saps ended up getting fed to the powers of pain this week. Well, actually, in the case of Randy Hogan, it was hysterical. Just because it's Randy Hogan. And y'all remember how last week there was a Larry Zbyszko squash with Randy Hogan that I called disappointing? Mainly because Larry just kind of beat the guy flat in 2 minutes with his finish, after doing basically nothing the entire time. Well, this week, the Powers of Pain, they played with this Randy Hogan fella for a while. They beat on him, and they beat on him, and they beat on him for a very long time. It was quite glorious. The best moments were when Randy would actually try to fight back, just trying to hit Barbarian and Warlord in the chest. They just no-sell it. Keep kicking the shit out of him. And they're throwing him all over the place like a lawn dart. And it is important to note, too, Randy Hogan was not what you would call a small man. He had a bit of size to him, especially in the belly region. Of course, Powers of Pain just pick him up and slam him like he's nothing. And after about 5 minutes of this wonderful onslaught, finally Warlord goes to pick up Randy for a vertical suplex. And as Warlord nearly elevated him over his shoulder and lost his balance, Barbarian comes off the top with a diving crossbody. Somehow Randy's neck was not broken as a result. Then they gave him a spinebuster lariat combo for the 3. A much better utilization of Randy Hogan. Beat him like a government mule. Don't let the guy get in any offense. And make sure you let everybody know this man is not Hulk Hogan. As if it took anyone more than 3 seconds to draw that conclusion. And then we went back to the interview podium with Paul Jones and the Powers of Pain. We received a little more vital information here from the boys. We learned from Paul here that in order for the Powers of Pain to eliminate the Road Warriors from the wrestling business, they cannot back up. Rather, they must move forward. Huh. Interesting. So for the Powers of Pain to rid the Legion of Doom from Crockett Promotions, they must go forward as opposed to backing up. Are they operating a steamroller? Perhaps some type of heavy machinery? Not entirely sure what any of that means. But then again, I have to remember it's Paul Jones talking, so I'm never sure what he means when he cuts promos half the time. He basically vowed the Powers of Pain would eliminate the Road Warriors from wrestling. Same shit we've been hearing for weeks. Nothing groundbreaking. But now it is time for our scheduled TV title match. Well, rescheduled, as we found out because Shane Douglas couldn't make the show. For the World's TV title, it's gorgeous Jimmy Garvin challenging Mike Rotunda. Yeah, remember when Jimmy Garvin used to have entrance music for the show? Apparently those days are long gone. He's just out there waiting for the Varsity Club to make their entrance. He's definitely been lowered on the totem pole. Now, we've already talked about what's going on here with Garvin, Precious, and the Varsity Club. I won't bore you to death with details of Sullivan doing his cryptic promos on threatening Precious and just kind of acting creepy. I guess you could sort of call this a grudge match, although they didn't outright refer to it as one. Still, though, from what we saw, it was pretty damn good. The crowd was really hot for Jimmy when he was in control. You know, they did a lot of basic amateur stuff back and forth. You know, like the various parts where Jimmy was trying to fight back during the heat, but Rotunda would keep cutting him off and pull him down to the mat with takedown holds. You know, it's all moderately basic stuff until we get to the end where Garvin gets the visual 3 count on Rotunda, but Sullivan throws Rotunda's foot under the bottom rope after Teddy had already counted the 3 count. It's kind of vital. So there's all this controversy going on. Sullivan tries to hit the apron to run interference, but Precious picks his ankle. That way Garvin could run in and start choking Sullivan. And meanwhile, in the background, Rick Steiner was in the back trying to feed a coat hanger to Rotunda. And they wound up choking out Garvin with it as Teddy came over to call the match off because Garvin was rendered unconscious. And they had some of the underneath baby faces empty out from the locker room to try to help. Didn't do any good. I did wonder where the fuck Ron Garvin was during all this. Or any of the top baby faces for that matter. Apparently none of them gave a shit about Jimmy Garvin. But this worked. You know, they tied everything in with what the Varsity Club did to Barry not too long ago. You know, Jimmy Garvin's one of those guys that we haven't really seen featured in a major capacity since, God, I guess around this time last year. Yeah, I remember it was right around this period in 87 last year. They had already shot the angle with the Midnight's burning Ron Garvin's face. And that kind of facilitated Jimmy Garvin's face turn afterwards. It's kind of interesting how we look at him a year later. I mean, he's on the show. He's still getting booked. But he's nowhere near as hot as he was in 87. Certainly not as a top babyface. I mean, he's just another example of a guy that's spinning his wheels. Now, I know we're still a little bit out from the revitalized Freebirds run. When you have Michael Hayes being out of the picture temporarily, it kind of gives Jimmy Garvin a sense of being directionless. But I enjoyed the match. Good angle at the end. Really nothing I found wrong with the segment. We came back for a quick JJ promo. Really not much to say about this one. He plugged the upcoming Omni show the following night, referring to the Ole Luger Dusty versus Tully Arm Flair cage match. He said the Horsemen are still on their mission to run roughshod at the next 2 big events. He's obviously talking about the Clash of Champions and the Crockett Cup. Talked about Sting, claiming that people have said there's no counter for the Scorpion Deathlock. And that may in fact be true for most people, but not for Ric Flair. And then we went to the ring for Tully and Arn versus Steve Atkinson and Dave Spearman. Now this was innovative. I really like what they did here with JJ. They decided to attach a clip-on mic to his necktie so we could not only hear his commentary during the match, but so that when he moved in closer to the ring, we could actually hear the job guys scream in agony as Tully and Arn had them in mat holds. Of course, the Horsemen are just kind of laughing about it, treating it like another day at the office. But JJ was awesome here as a ringside coach, cheering his boys on, telling them to keep applying the pressure. I mean, my favorite part here, it's a spot where Tully and Arn are wrestling Spearman to the mat and putting him in an arm wringer. And they're just cranking on the guy for several minutes. And while this poor Spearman is crying out in pain, you get JJ a few feet away going, "I'm thinking you better stop it, ref. Be responsible." And as Spearman refused to give up, JJ just kept dropping gill bombs on Teddy Long like, "All right, dude. His fate is in your hands." He was such a conniving weasel here. It was awesome. And meanwhile, he finally tags in Atkinson so Arn could immediately plant him with a brainbuster DDT. They start beating the shit out of him for a while. And eventually we get the double-A spine buster followed by a slingshot suplex for the 3 count. By far the best Horseman squash of 1988 so far. All because of JJ's ringside involvement. And him just having a hell of a time basking in the Horseman ambush. I'm actually kind of surprised they waited this long to test the clip-on mic spot. I mean, it added so much to a match that kind of would have been otherwise missing with JJ just kind of standing there totally silent. I hope they have this as a special feature for all the Horseman Studio squashes going forward. Man, if they come out next week and they wrestle a regular tag match without the JJ commentary, I'll be quite saddened. But that transitioned nicely into the Horseman promo after the break, where Tully informed us that they could have easily plowed through those guys in 30 seconds. But tonight was about proving their worth and honing their skill as a tag team. Something the rest of the locker room knows nothing about. That's why the Horsemen are among the elite in this sport. And then Arn explained that when it comes to the Horsemen, they're nothing but purebred pro wrestlers. They're not superstars or Hollywood entertainers. They don't need all the glitter and glamour to prove why they're the best in the league. And he just wants the fans to remember that whether or not they buy a ticket to see the Horsemen kick ass and win, they aren't the ones paying the Horsemen's paychecks. It's Jim Crockett. Some nice little subtle digs at the sports entertainment crap, all of which was happening up north with the opposition. But he also referenced a couple baby faces in the locker room when he mentioned face paint and glittery attire. I mean, in a way, he kind of called out Flair with mentioning glittery attire. But I guess you could throw Luger into that category because he used to come out sporting the big robes. It was good shit. Cut and dry. Very simple. It's Horseman business as usual. They're pro wrestlers. Nothing fancy about the way they work or carry themselves. It's all about the money. Then we had Rick Steiner versus Gary Royal. Another varsity club mugging here. As Rick Steiner just took his time playing with this guy and, well, quite literally riding him like a pony at one point. Dumping him on his shoulder with a takedown. Grabbing at his tongue and profoundly claiming, "I've got his tongue!" To which Tony goes, "That's not funny." I mean, I thought it was. So Steiner's working over Royal, stretching him like a human pretzel. And Okay, I wrote this down here. Now that I see the print again, I remember exactly how the finish went down. So allow for me to read you exactly how I interpreted this. Steiner gives Royal a German suplex and then submits him with a full Nelson while playing with his penis. No, I know that sounds rather off-putting at first, but here's the best part. I'm not joking. The finish was Steiner winning with a full Nelson while also essentially giving Gary Royal a hand job. He grabbed at his junk, had a big wide grin on his face. That was the final visual we saw of the segment. Was Rick Steiner playing with another man's junk on nationwide TV? Can't make this shit up, folks. This was pro wrestling in the 1980s. We also had a great closing line from Kevin Sullivan here. While he's putting over his men, he's poking fun at the Road Warriors phrase, snack on danger and dine on death. So Sullivan goes, well, my men eat lightning bolts and burp thunder. I guess he was not permitted to say crap lightning. I also liked how while Sullivan's talking, Mike Rotunda's in the back trying to get Rick Steiner's attention to hold up the Florida heavyweight title. They got into a brief shoving match. And for anybody still wondering, yes, technically Rick Steiner is still the Florida heavyweight champion. Even though Rotunda is technically the co-owner of the belt, since he basically just gave the belt to Steiner. I don't believe they've acknowledged the Florida heavyweight title since that moment. But, yeah. That was basically that. I mean, at one point, Steiner tried to interject, but Sullivan basically told him to shut up. But that was how they went out for the week. Very weird show. Still a good amount of fun moments. Man, looking at the calendar here, we are 2 weeks out from the first Clash of Champions. And I did say we are going to review that on the channel in substitution for the Saturday syndicated program. If there even is one, I still haven't checked. But the Clash review will be a lot of fun. I have not seen that show in quite a while, but I've seen it so many times. I mean, that Midnight's Fantastics match, good Lord. That's an all-timer. Flair and Sting. That goes without saying. I'm trying to recall some other stuff offhand. What else was on that card? Well, obviously the barbed wire 6-man with Dusty and the Road Warriors against the Powers of Pain. I mean, that match is more infamously noteworthy than for good reasons. But yeah, it should be a lot of fun. So we'll do one last Saturday episode before the big showdown. And we'll see what awaits us as we approach the Crockett Cup tournament in April. And before you know it, we'll be in the early stages of the Bash Tour. A lot of good stuff to look forward to. So Midsouth had an interesting show this week. And they were juggling a lot of different storylines throughout the program. Now, last week, things were more match-heavy. It's probably the section in the taping block where they were just trying to get through a bunch of people on the card and have them do wrestling matches. You know, not really focusing on the big angles or anything. Even though we did have the return of Mr. Olympia to television. But he was mainly there just to get a quick win over the Rat Pack. They didn't really delve into much more than that. But this week, story was a lot different. It was a lot more angle-driven, as we'll come to talk about during all the Wrestling 2 stuff. I Well, I did jot down that Boyd was back to sporting the blood red suit. Last week, I think I said it was a tomato pasty color. Now that I'm seeing it again, it almost kind of looked grapefruit. Maybe it was the lighting. So they open up with Bill Watts pitching to a match in Houston that took place a month or so back, pitting Mr. Wrestling 2 against the Iron Sheik. Sheiky was sporting his curl-toed boots here. One of my all-time favorite boot designs. Like, no one else ever did anything like that. It was so cool. And this, well, I think it was mainly designed to showcase Wrestling 2 and keep him on people's radars, because he was kind of a central focus of this week's show. He's still currently entangled with the mystery stalker storyline, but, you know, in terms of where he is in the pecking order right now on the program, he's not necessarily the main priority each week. So I think they just kind of wanted to remind us, you know, this guy still exists. Make sure you cheer for him. Really not much beyond that, though. Wrestling 2 went over with a running knee. Now, this had been taped back a while ago, so I have to assume this was right before Sheik went to the WWF to work the title program with Backlund. I can't remember specifically when that would have been in 83, but like, I know Sheik was up north working for Vince by sometime in mid to late 83. And they said this was taped in February. So this may have been one of the final things Sheik did before his send-off. So as we come back to the ring for our opening match in Shreveport, it's the Black Ninja versus Ron Ellis. I think he meant Black Ninja. Maybe it was a Southern thing. Oh yeah, by the way, Reeser Bowden was still on his paid vacation. So I think Jack Curtis was the man that filled in for him this week. Last week I didn't even catch the name, but I heard Jack Curtis multiple times throughout the show, so I presume that was his name. I think I'm just kind of going out on a limb there. Yet again, Watts informs us that Nagasaki's bald spot is, quote, ritualistic. Yes, it was intentional that he shaved his head to look like a bird's nest. My notes were very succinct here, and looking back, I really don't think I missed all that much. Nagasaki wins with a thrust kick. I believe that is all. And that took us to this awesome segment with Boyd Pierce and Hacksaw Duggan after the break. I can probably count on one hand the amount of times I've seen Boyd Pierce get visibly irritated with somebody on camera. I think Duggan may have struck a nerve. Boyd's spending like 2 minutes trying to pitch to this clip of Duggan versus Chavo Guerrero from late last year. Meanwhile, Duggan's sitting there prolonging it by talking over Boyd constantly, like using every possible tactic to stall for time and avoid having them actually show the clip. And the longer Duggan kept interrupting Boyd, the angrier Boyd got. Like, if you actually watch his face when he turns to look at Duggan, he's got that "will you shut the fuck up" expression. It was iconic. Oh man, and Duggan was so great here. Saying the only reason Chavo won that match was because Duggan spent the previous night flying across the country, so he was clearly jet-lagged. And so we go to the video feed, and I remember this as soon as they showed the clip. It was the match where Duggan tried to spear Chavo in the corner, but when Chavo did the leapfrog, Duggan went headfirst into the post, came up gushing blood from the forehead after Chavo had given him the sunset pin. So Duggan's calling it a fluke win. You know, saying that we all clearly saw what happened. Chavo didn't beat no one. Hacksaw Duggan got beat by the corner post. Now Chavo's going to run around with that tape claiming that it got a legit win over Duggan. Well, Duggan's got some footage to show. He's going to show what happens when the big guns try to step up to the plate and challenge Duggan to a straight fight. So we go to the December 11th, 1982 tape when Tony Atlas squared off with Duggan. Of course, they made sure they kept the part in where Atlas beat Duggan in the arm wrestling contest. I'm sure Duggan didn't appreciate that. But this is the match where it all kind of broke down with the Rat Pack interfering. And while DiBiase was on the floor waving a towel over Duggan to get him to come to, Matt Bourne had the official on the other side. They ended up doing the momentary ref bump. While DiBiase and Bourne got beat up by Atlas, Duggan slipped in the gimmicked helmet and then ran in to tackle Atlas with a spear for the 3 count. And while Duggan's gloating over the victory at the booth with Boyd, he's like, "There's a lesson to be learned there too, Boyd." And Boyd perfectly retorts by going, "There sure is, Hacksaw. The lesson is that the Rat Pack can never handle business on their own." And of course that rubs Duggan the wrong way, so he pouts and takes off. And now Boyd just looks at the camera with that classic grin, and they go right to commercial. Awesome segment. I love heel Jim Duggan so much. I'm like, I don't know. Part of me is going to be mildly disappointed when they eventually blow off the babyface turn, because I know it's coming, but it's like, you know, he's done such great work as a heel with the Rat Pack. Like, I almost don't want to see him turn, you know? He's that good. Just this little interaction between him and Boyd Pierce. It was flawless. You know, while the segment was mostly recap material, you know, they still found a way to keep it entertaining with having Hacksaw comment on both the clips and try to prop himself up. So from there, we came back for Mr. Wrestling 2 and Tiger Conway Jr. versus Ted DiBiase and Matt Bourne. And while the match had several key points, the central theme in all this was Bill Watts pointing out the giant suitcase of Wrestling 2 memorabilia that meticulously showed up. It was a giant collection of all Wrestling 2's defamed masks and letters that were kind of thrown into a giant pile. And this all supposedly happened during the break when the suitcase showed up. So they were going to address more of it after the match. It's like kind of one of those rare moments where I'm like, well, fuck the match. I want to know what's going on with all this Wrestling 2 apparel. It had the inverse effect of getting me to want to see the match. You know, one thing I thought during all this, and this was really neat, you know, Bill Watts started bringing up the fathers of Tiger Conway, Ted DiBiase, and Matt Bourne, trying to basically tie them all together by saying they all had successful careers by their own right, but how it's time for their sons to create legacies and reputations of their own. Like, I didn't even really consider. I'm like, well, yeah, that's right. There's a lot of second-generation talent in this one tag match. And Tiger Conway's obviously still green, but he looked pretty good in there. God, it was better than that match last week where he was fumbling around with Ron Kessler, looking like a bull in a china shop with all the shit they were fucking up left and right. You know, skipping ahead here while it's on my mind, because I know I'll forget. There's a spot where Tiger Conway gave Matt Bourne basically a deadlift vertical suplex from a kneeling position. It was really impressive. Like, Matt Bourne's not a small guy. And nor is Tiger Conway a jacked up musclehead. Like, that was a huge feat of strength. But they had a nice formula here. Tiger Conway was a perfect babyface in peril for the heat portion. Made a nice little comeback before tagging in Wrestling 2 so he could clean shop for a minute. And then we get this insane finishing sequence that just tore the house down. Like all kinds of shit going on at the end with, Wrestling 2 and DiBiase colliding heads so Bourne could give 2 the illegal bombs away when the ref wasn't looking. You had all kinds of stuff going on the floor with Bourne and Conway getting into a fight. Alfred Neely was trying to go after Ted DiBiase, who kept trying to illegally load up the glove. And of course, Wrestling 2 ducks the fist drop, ends up catching DiBiase with a knee lift, which inadvertently bumps Neely out to the floor. And this was my favorite spot in the entire show, bar none. The fucking upset tackle of the century. All right, so Bourne's got a steel chair, and he's loading up to hit Wrestling 2 with it from literally out of nowhere, like a hawk just swooping in. Conway shoulder blocks Bourne from the top rope. Chair goes flying out of the ring like a missile. Both guys take this great bump and sell it like they're dead. Oh, it looked phenomenal. And while everyone continues to fight with the chair, finally 2 jumps on top of Bourne while he's down. Conway goes to grab the ref. And this is awesome too. Just trying to inconspicuously move the chair away so the ref doesn't see it. Like Conway goes, ref, the count. Wait, hold on. Pay no attention to this folding chair as I conveniently move it out of the way. Now go count. Fantastic. Wonderful controlled chaos. Now, this might have been my favorite finish in all of the Mid-South matches we reviewed thus far. And it was simply for that one spot with Conway tackling Bourne to knock the chair out of his hand. It was so perfectly timed. They could not have replicated a spot like that if they tried. No freaking way. Loved it. Awesome sequence. But we got to get to the real meat of the matter here, so it's time to reveal what's going on with all this Wrestling 2 apparel. Now, we were told from Bill Watts that there was an altercation between Wrestling 2 and Mr. Olympia that the camera team picked up on. Clearly, both men were upset with each other. So, Wrestling 2 is here to explain what the situation was about. And before we see the footage, he wants to establish what's going on here. Right as they were getting set to have the tag match, Mr. Olympia had been seen walking around with a briefcase, and somehow the briefcase got bumped over, but the latch opened up, and all that Wrestling 2 apparel just shot out of the case. So Wrestling 2 went to try to confront Olympia about it in the locker room, ask him if it's his suitcase or not, and Olympia was apparently playing dumb by claiming he knew nothing about it. It's all black and white. Based on the evidence presented here, well, it's clear that Olympia's behind all this. And of course, Bill Watts is trying to be the mediator and say, well, this is America, damn it. Innocent until proven guilty, brother. Now, he reminds, too, that Mr. Olympia was the one that took his place in that tag match where Olympia was forced out of Midsouth for 90 days when he ate the fall. So before we draw conclusions here, maybe we should get Olympia's side of the story. And I did gloss over the footage, but, it was exactly what Wrestling 2 laid out. We see them kind of walking down the staircase from the locker room, holding the briefcase. Olympia was allegedly trying to plead his case. And when 2 threw the case at him and it popped open again, Olympia scrambled to try to collect all the pieces. And then 2 gave him a knee lift, which sent the rest of the babyface locker room running down to separate both men. And, it did seem oddly suspicious here. The fact that Olympia was so quick to try to gather up all the evidence and throw it back in the suitcase. If he knew nothing about it, why so quick to try to hide everything? Well, it's obviously a very heated situation, so we do need to get Mr. Olympia's commentary on it. But first we had to see him squash Marty Lundy. Fans are already hesitant to cheer Olympia based on what we saw just minutes prior. Really not much to say about it. Watts pointed out that Olympia was more aggressive than normal here, so it was a noticeable tactic. But he also chalked it up to him being upset over what we saw, so it was a good attention to detail. Ultimately, he went over with a sleeper, and that set up the ringside interview with him and Watts, where we tried to get some clarity on what's going on here. And naturally, Olympia explained that he really doesn't know what's going on. He's been gone for the last few months. He's been out of the loop. Now, he doesn't deny that it's his suitcase. But clearly, somebody broke the lock and replaced Olympia's stuff with Wrestling 2's apparel. It's a setup, brother. But he did a good job covering his ground, explaining he has no reason to be behind any of this. He took Wrestling 2's place in that tag match out of the goodness of his heart. Why would he have an incentive to set up Wrestling 2? What's the motive? And Watts basically responded by saying, well, we've seen plenty of evil men on this roster do some wicked, corrupted stuff in the past. If it turns out it's the Rat Pack or Kamala or even Skandar Akbar behind the whole thing, well, he wouldn't be surprised. But he just hopes that Mr. Olympia isn't tied up in this somehow. So that is currently where we stand. Mr. Olympia is denying it. Again, yes, his suitcase. But he was not responsible for concealing all Wrestling 2's gear inside. Someone is clearly out to get him. So we got to see where more of this Scooby-Doo mystery takes us in the coming weeks. It's really good, though. I've been enjoying everything about this Wrestling 2 story from the beginning. It's taken so many twists and turns along the way, but now I think we're starting to fit the pieces together a little bit. Slowly by surely. And then after that, we had a quick standby match with Kelly Kiniski and Ron Kessler versus Tim Horner and Art Cruz. They only had like 2 minutes, so I really didn't even bother writing anything down. Kessler did not visibly fuck anything up this time. But, well, then again, the match wasn't really long enough for him to screw anything up. No finish. I did laugh at the closing sign-off, though, as we hear, until next week, for our guest commentator, Boyd Pierce, I'm Boyd Pierce, and so long, everyone. Slapstick comedy at its finest, folks. He knew he fucked up. But, yeah, this is a really great show. Loved everything with the Wrestling 2 Mr. Olympia angle. I'm loving all the dots that we're finally connecting with all this. And the tag match beforehand was awesome. The stuff with Hacksaw Duggan earlier on, that was a lot of fun. Again, very different format compared to last week where they kind of kept everything mostly centered around the TV matches. This week, they were really trying to hit the ground running with all the developing Wrestling 2 saga. And we're still unclear about what's going on. Nothing's been plainly defined. But we are starting to figure things out. Our suspicions about Mr. Olympia's motives. And others are starting to be called into question a little bit. Now we just wait and see how Mr. Wrestling 2 responds. For now, it's time to turn our attention to World Class. And I'll tell you, man, after that Mid-South episode we just recapped, God, watching this show is like coming down from a high. Well, that's not entirely true. The main event was pretty good. And we did get a pretty big plot development with the Chris Adams-Gary Hart pairing. But I would say the show overall was less action-packed compared to Mid-South. I don't know, maybe I had to start modifying the World Class and Mid-South reviews. Consider doing a flip-flop so the Mid-South shows come last. But that would also necessitate more effort on my part when it comes to formatting, and Lord knows I have more time to do that. Anywho, the show is primarily built around the Midnight's Fantastics title match. The rest of the show, you could pretty much just slap a giant sticky note on it and read optional viewing. Because I'm going to be honest, even as I skim over some bullet points here, I barely remember these matches taking place. Like the opener with Brian Adias and El Diablo. I mean, it's entirely possible I watched that match. I mean, I didn't really write anything down about it except the finish. I did leave a side note here about the massive amount of leg hair that Diablo was rocking. Even in non-HD, you could see that shit plain as day. Grotesque. But yeah, that's pretty much all I got out of that one. Brian Adias wins with a figure four. And El Diablo's leg hair. I mean, what more do you want? It was an absolutely forgettable match by every definition of the word. But moving on with some major chapter development on this week's episode. One of the bigger stories they've had going with World Class in the last several months is the ongoing relationship with Chris Adams and Gary Hart. Hart's been on a mission to try to make sure Adams becomes a world champion. He's been trying to help Adams climb the ladder and become his top star in the Dallas area, trying to make him the next guy to carry the torch. Basically taking him under his wing to create the next megastar. So Chris fired him. Yeah. That apparently escalated quickly. So, well, okay. Let's back it up a little bit. How do we get here? First, we have to go to Fort Worth, where Adams and Hart are seen confronting each other in the ring over an issue that took place. Allegedly, Hart had tried to dismiss himself from the relational working agreement with Adams, basically leaving him out to dry while Adams was currently involved with his feud with Ric Flair. So Adams punched Gary Hart in the jaw and fired him on the spot. To which Hart told Adams that he will make sure he never becomes world champion. So fast forward in the timeline, we see the last few minutes of the Flair-Adams title match. And right as Gino Hernandez tried to get involved and help Adams gain the advantage, we see the one-man gang hit the ring with a chain to hit Adams for the blatant DQ. So Hart cost Adams the title. And I think the big question now is trying to figure out, okay, so they went there. How did this all kind of circulate with such short notice? Moreover, when were Chris Adams and Gary Hart ever teasing dissension on TV? When did they have issues that were ever acknowledged publicly? As far as I know, I thought they were on the same page. Apparently there was shit going on behind the scenes that they never informed us about. So we fast forward to Gary Hart's home. Him and Bill Mercer are having a sit-down. They're basically having tea time is what they're having. Although I think they were drinking iced tea as opposed to standard hot tea. And I had to admit, this is a pretty phenomenal segment. So Gary's here explaining that Adams is a bright young man, but he's also an egotistical man. And he's let that punk Gino Hernandez get inside his head, convince him that he doesn't need Gary Hart to bring him to the promised land. But Gary's not blaming Gino for that. He's blaming Chris for allowing his ego to get the best of him. And while Gary's getting more visibly frustrated, he starts pounding the table several times. And I think the idea is that he was trying to purposefully knock the pitcher of tea over so that it would spill all over the place. And every single time he goes to pound the table, something else would tumble over and dump everywhere. Like first it was the pitcher of tea, then it was his glass of tea, then it was Bill's. Like you could tell he is strategically going out of his way to try to make sure he knocks over as much shit as possible. I'm sure Bill was laughing off camera. Finally, at the end, he just wiped the table entirely and then flipped it over while he looks into the camera and tells Chris, "I'm gonna get you, brother." That is the worst possible Gary Hart accent I could do, but I don't know many men that can do a Gary Hart accent now that I think about it. But it was a damn fine promo. It was just so amusing, like watching them beat the crap out of the table constantly to try to knock over the glasses. Meanwhile, Mercer has to sit there and no-sell it and just keep asking general questions. And, again, you really think about all this. The breakup, kind of rushed. Maybe a little forced and out of nowhere. I don't know, it's just very weird. Like 2 weeks ago, these guys were perfectly fine working together. There's never been any indication that Gary had problems with Gino. It's like when I heard Gary and Chris broke up, I was like, okay, where did this come from? The other thing, too, is like, you kind of look back at when these guys started working together. It hasn't been all that long. And they only just recently brought in the one-man gang as the muscle to sort of watch Chris's back. I mean, he didn't really do a good job at that. Now Chris is basically fighting on his own. Based on everything we've seen them do in the lead up to this moment, I just never got the sense there was any bad blood between Hart and Adams. But what's done is done. I'm also not entirely sure who the face and who the heel is in this dynamic. I guess it's one of those things where the fans have to kind of pick and choose sides. But we'll monitor this going forward. See where it leads in the coming weeks. So that brought us to Johnny Mantell versus Skip Young. Another match on the card this week that I vaguely recall seeing. Did not write much down about it. Now, Skip made his return to Dallas a couple weeks ago after he'd been gone for a period of time. So I think this was mainly just an opportunity for them to get him back on TV to reconnect him with the fans. Of course, they couldn't just fucking have the guy win because he's wrestling Johnny Mantell. So obviously it was going to go to a time limit draw. Skip tried to fire up in the last minute, but he missed a drop kick off the ropes. And that basically narrowed the time window down. The bell sounded before anybody could muster up any more offense. Most of the rest of what I saw involved lots of laying around on the mat in holds. It was about as boring as you would imagine. This fucking Johnny Mantell, dude. Every single time this guy gets booked, I hate him that much more. Seriously, they never beat this fucking guy. Even in circumstances where he clearly ought to be doing the job. Help get someone over that is obviously a bigger star than he could ever hope to be. Nope. Got to make sure he doesn't lose. He's becoming world class's version of Grayson Waller. I mean, you look at him for 3 seconds, you're like, I mean, this guy should eat the pin in the end, no doubt. Of course, it never happens. Always going out of their way to protect him. Even though there's nothing remotely special about him as a wrestler or talent. It's the same thing with Johnny. There's nothing remotely special about him. He's a dude. As generic as they come. Yet they never beat the guy. God. Pisses me off. I'm probably like the one person in existence that gets more infuriated by Johnny Mantell the more I see of him. Like, seriously, the fact that they constantly have this guy working 10-minute Broadways just to make sure he never has to lose the fall. Fuck, dude. Eat a dick. More specifically, Ken Mantell. Go eat a dick. Worst booker ever. So moving on with the main event. Before I have a conniption on camera. It is the Midnights versus the Fantastics for the American Tag Titles. Round 3. At least this would be the world-class version of round 3. In actuality, it's probably like round 47 when you cover all the other territories they wrestled in. Not that I have an issue with watching the Midnights and the Fantastics wrestle 47 times. It's always a great match when we see it. The crowd energy for these things is through the roof. I mean, just when you factor in the amount of heat the Midnights have versus just how white-hot the Fantastics were in Dallas, they were cooking. But they kept everything fairly simple. As always, Bobby and Dennis are great feeders for the Fantastics offense. They spent a while letting the babyfaces run wild. Kind of worked the story where, anytime Ian and Condrey would try to double-team the faces or cheat behind David Manning's back, Fantastics would find a way to regain control and keep the momentum on their side. And they do eventually cut off Tommy Rogers. Good stuff with them dumping him out to the floor onto the concrete so Eden could take a few cheap shots while Manning wasn't looking. And eventually we get Fulton making the big comeback. Everything kind of breaks down into the usual pandemonium. And right as Corny tries to help Eden out by tripping up Fulton during an Irish whip attempt, they get a visible 2 count. So that leads Corny to hit the ring with the tennis racket, give Fulton the illegal racket shot to the back of the neck, forcing a DQ, obviously. But the Midnights retain the belts on the DQ decision. So the crowd was not happy about that. Took a minute for the reality to set in, but eventually they figured it out. They popped when they heard the Fantastics won. But then when Mark Lorenz said, but the Midnights keep the belts on account of the DQ, kind of sucked the air out of the room. But yeah, match was awesome. Chemistry here never fails. I mean, these guys could have had brilliant matches while blindfolded and crippled if they wanted to. But they definitely indicated, based on the finish here, that there's more to come out of this in the future. I guess they had one of those artificial stipulations where if the Fantastics didn't win, they would never get another shot at the belts. And, even though they won, it was because of interference from Corny. So at the end of the day, they did kind of get fucked out of the belts. Some tells me we'll be hearing more about this in the future weeks. Another thing, too, to keep on the radar we have Sunshine's big surprise for next week. She said she was bringing in somebody to Dallas to help handle this Cornette business. Who might that be? Well, we'll find out. Well, obviously I remember who it is. I mean, Cornette's only recounted the story a dozen or so times on his podcast. It is, spoiler alert, not a good surprise. I would just halt the conversation there. The key word in that phrase is big. Remember that. But that was world class for the week. Pretty big story-driven show with the Chris Adams-Gary Hart pairing, although mildly hasty in its execution. But again, we'll see where that leads on future shows. It's a very interesting heel versus heel dynamic. It's not often we see world class go to the well with heel versus heel feuds. But then again, this one actually kind of makes sense too if you're kind of following the trajectory of it, because both parties have been steadily unbearable pricks on television, for what it's worth. So the fans are left to pick and choose sides. It'll be interesting to see who they cheer for, kind of deciding between the lesser of two evils. But, yeah, that was world class. And fuck Johnny Mantell. So, rounding it out. As always, I appreciate people that come back to support the channel every week. Make sure you stop back on Monday for the next Monday installment of the FSWR podcast. And pretty soon we'll be marching right into WrestleMania season, so I'll keep you posted what I'm going to do for that weekend. And thanks everybody for watching. I'm horrible with the outros, but my brain is kind of fried at the moment, so I'm not thinking of anything clever to say. So bye. That's my outro. Take care. Peace out.